They say storms don't just hit the land, they hit the pride of those who refuse to see what's coming. My name is David Miller, and when I moved into Maple Creek Estates, I thought I was buying peace. Instead, I bought front row seats to the kind of arrogance only a homeowners association can deliver. I knew the creek behind our houses was a ticking clock. I built my sandbag barrier not for decoration but for survival. But to Avery Lopez, the HOA president, those bags weren't protection, they were ugly. And in the HOA's world, ugly is a crime worse than water rising to your doorstep. So when Avery had my sandbag barrier torn down the night before the storm, I already knew what was coming. What I didn't know was how fast karma can flow. By morning. The flood had swallowed half the street and carried away Avery's pride, a $1 million luxury car twisted and broken in the creek like a child's toy. Before we dive into this story of HOA, pride, betrayal, and revenge served by Mother Nature herself, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you enjoy these wild HOA dramas, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next storm. They say when you retire, you finally get the chance to slow down, to sit back on a porch with a mug of coffee and watch the seasons roll by. That was my plan when I left 25 years of civil infrastructure work behind. I had spent a career knee-deep in blueprints and stormwater projects for the Army Corps of Engineers. After enough decades of fighting nature with concrete and steel, I thought I had earned myself a little calm. That calm, I believed, would come in the form of a tidy house in Maple Creek Estates, a neighborhood advertised as exclusive, tranquil, and secure. The brochure showed sunlit cul-de-sacs, children riding bicycles without helmets, manicured lawns as uniform as military drill lines. It was the kind of place that promised order. But what the brochure didn't mention was the creek, Maple Creek, a slender ribbon of water that curled like a sleeping snake behind the back lots. From a distance, it looked harmless, picturesque even. Realtors called it a natural feature. To me, it was a red flag. Creeks don't stay calm in storm season, and this one ran lower than the roadbed, with houses stacked on a slope that funneled straight toward its banks. All it would take was one heavy rainstorm, and the entire neighborhood would be baptized whether they wanted it or not. I noticed it the very first week I moved in. The ground dipped like a shallow bowl, every lawn tilting ever so slightly toward the bend. You didn't need instruments to see it, just a careful eye. The storm drains were decorative at best, too small, half-clogged by mulch. The HOA insisted landscapers spread. And the retaining walls along the creek, purely aesthetic limestone veneers, not reinforced, not waterproofed. Pretty but useless when water rose in anger. I wasn't the kind of man to keep quiet when I saw danger. So at the first HOA meeting, standing in that perfumed clubhouse where residents sat in folding chairs, sipping lemonade, I pulled out my old elevation maps. I showed them how runoff from the development up the hill would race straight into our cul-de-sac. I pointed out that FEMA's flood maps had been updated only because some clever lobbying got the zone redesignated to save on insurance premiums. I didn't raise my voice, didn't wave my arms. I laid out facts neat and calm like I'd done 1,000 times for commanding officers. That's when I met Avery Lopez, HOA president. A woman in her late 50s, always in pressed blazers and pearls, who treated the neighborhood like a stage and herself like the star. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and gave me a smile so tight it could cut glass. "Mr. Miller," she said, "we appreciate your enthusiasm. But this community was designed by professionals. Our focus is maintaining property values and neighborhood aesthetics. Please don't spread unnecessary alarm." Some folks chuckled. Others shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting away. I knew that look. Soldiers used to give it before a briefing went sour, the silent plea to just drop it. I realized then that arguing with Avery was like arguing with the tide, pointless, so I stopped pushing. Instead, I prepared my own property. Quietly, thoroughly, I bought sandbags in bulk, stored them in my garage. I walked the slope of my lawn measuring runoff paths with a contractor's level. I kept my tools sharp and my instincts sharper. That summer passed with nothing more than a few heavy rains, but the soil told me the truth. By early fall, it was waterlogged from weeks of drizzle. The ground couldn't take much more. When meteorologists announced a tropical system spinning north, I felt it in my bones before the Doppler radar caught it. The air thickened, the birds vanished, and the sky darkened in that way that makes your gut tighten. I spent the next morning stacking sandbags in a crescent around my back fence and garden beds. Sweat trickled down my neck, even in the cool wind. My joints ached from the lifting, but I kept at it. These weren't for decoration. They were the line between water and ruin. That's when Avery's silver SUV rolled up, gleaming like it had never seen a raindrop. The window slid down with a smug hiss. "Mr. Miller," she called out sweetly, "what are those I didn't even look up from the bag I was placing?" "Sandbags, ma'am. Storm's coming." Her door opened and out, she stepped in spotless white sneakers that had clearly never touched mud. Her HOA badge was clipped to her jacket like it gave her authority beyond the gates of this neighborhood. "You can't just put those out," she declared, heels crunching against the gravel. "They're unsightly. They violate the landscaping guidelines." I wiped my palms against my jeans, stood and faced her. So do half the SUVs parked sideways in driveways. But I don't complain. Her lips pursed. "This is serious. We can't have residents panicking others with doomsday props. It lowers confidence in property values." I pointed to the sky, gray and heavy, ready to burst. "Give it 12 hours. That creek's gonna climb right into our backyards. These aren't props, they're protection," she huffed. "The board hasn't approved them. You'll need to remove them or face a citation." My patience was thin, but I kept my voice level. "Do what you have to, but I'm not letting floodwater walk through my living room just so the neighborhood looks pretty." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't answer. She stomped back to her SUV, the sound of her tires spitting gravel as she pulled away. I watched her go, shaking my head. People like Avery thought rules could bend reality, but water doesn't negotiate, and it doesn't sign bylaws. By the afternoon, I'd finished the barrier. The air grew dense, pressing against my skin like a warning. News anchors flashed storm alerts across the screen. Still not a single email from the HOA. No guidance, no preparation, just silence. That night, as thunder rolled in the distance, I sat on my porch and sipped coffee, eyes on the creek. Avery's house, 2 lots up, sat closer to the bend. Her garage light flickered on illuminating her prized possession, a glossy, custom-ordered luxury car worth more than most homes on the block. $1 million of polished steel and pride. She hadn't moved it to higher ground. She hadn't listened at all. I leaned back, listening to the wind through the trees, the groan of the creek stirring awake. My sandbag stood ready, but something gnawed at me, not the storm, not the water, but the certainty that when pride meets nature, pride always drowns first. The rain hadn't even started when the real storm came knocking. Its name was Avery Lopez. The next morning, long before the first band of clouds reached Maple Creek, I was outside tightening the line of my sandbags, making sure every seam pressed snug against the earth. The air was sticky charged, the kind of heaviness that warns your body long before the radar does. That's when I heard the sound heels on gravel, sharp and deliberate. I turned to see Avery marching down my driveway, a folder tucked under her arm, lips already pursed like a judge about to issue a verdict. She was flanked by 2 HOA board members, clipboard carriers, the kind who nodded without thinking. They looked like a royal procession of compliance. "David Miller," Avery announced, voice high and crisp as if she were speaking to an audience. "We need to talk about your yard." I straightened up, leaning on my shovel like it was a staff. "We already talked, Avery. These sandbags stay until the storm passes." She gestured at them like they were piles of garbage. "These are unapproved modifications." Section 14, B. Landscaping Uniformity Clause. No earthworks barriers or foreign materials without board approval. I actually laughed. Sandbags aren't landscaping. They're a safety measure. Her smile froze thin as glass. "The board disagrees. And frankly, the optics matter. Residents don't want to feel like they live in a flood zone." I swept my arm toward the creek, its muddy banks already swollen from the week's earlier rain. "We are in a flood zone, whether your bylaws admit it or not. FEMA just downgraded the maps because your board lobbied to save on premiums." Her face stiffened, color rising beneath her makeup. "That's hearsay." "No, that's public record." The 2 clipboard carriers shifted uneasily, scribbling something but refusing to meet my eyes. Avery stepped closer, lowering her voice so only I could hear. "You think you're helping, but all you're doing is stirring fear. And fear damages property values. Remove them, or you'll be fined, and we will escalate." I leaned on my shovel, meeting her stare. "Go ahead, write your fine. You'll find I'm not the kind of man who folds because someone waves a rule book." She gave a sharp little laugh. "We'll see." Then she turned on her heel, heels snapping against the stones like a metronome of arrogance. The rest of the day passed under a thickening sky. Clouds stacked like bruised muscles in the distance, rolling toward us with purpose. My bones ached with the pressure, changed the same way they had in combat zones when storms stalked across deserts or jungles. By dusk, the neighborhood had gone eerily silent. No kids on bikes, no sprinklers ticking across lawns. Even the dogs seemed to sense something. I checked the local news. Flood alerts upgraded from watch to warning. 6 to 8 inches of rain expected in 12 hours. A slow-moving system, the worst kind, the kind that squats and pours until the ground gives up. By 10 p.m., I had inspected every sandbag twice, cleared the drainage ditch beside my garden, and set up my old storm radio on the kitchen counter. I thought I was ready. What I hadn't accounted for was sabotage. It started around midnight, a soft scraping sound, faint but deliberate. Then the thud of something heavy dragged across wet earth. My porch light was off, but I eased to the window, careful to avoid the squeaky floorboard by the door. Under the dull glow of a neighbor's security lamp, I saw movement. 2 figures hunched and working quickly. My eyes adjusted, and there she was, Avery Lopez herself, pearls gleaming, even in the dark, directing the operation like a general. Beside her was a teenager, lanky and nervous, her nephew. I guessed the one she'd mentioned at meetings. He was dragging one of my sandbags toward her SUV. I didn't move, didn't shout. I just pressed the record button on my porch camera's live feed. The night vision lens caught every detail, Avery's manicured hand gesturing the boy stumbling under the weight of the bag, the way she smirked when they kicked another one down the slope behind her yard. Teach him a lesson, her voice crackled faintly through the mic. That was all I needed. Evidence, hard, time-stamped proof. Still, I felt fury rising in my chest, hotter than the humid night air. These bags weren't decorations. They were my line of defense. And she was dismantling them bag by bag, giggling like a schoolgirl who thought she was clever. By the time they left, the crescent of protection I'd built was gutted. A third of my barrier rolled into the creek, another third dumped carelessly on her lawn. I stood at the window long after their SUV's taillights vanished, fists tight at my sides. I'd faced plenty of enemies in my career, but none as infuriating as suburban arrogance. An hour later, the sky cracked open. Rain slammed down in sheets, rattling the roof like gunfire. Wind tore through the trees, branches snapping debris, whipping across the yards. The creek groaned a deep animal sound that meant only one thing: it was rising fast. I yanked on a poncho and flashlight, rushing into the yard. Water already licked at my ankles. I tried dragging out old sandbags from the shed, but they were half-rotted, splitting at the seams. I couldn't stack them fast enough. Every bag I placed seemed to dissolve under the pounding rain. My back screamed, with each lift mud sucking at my boots, water racing past in little rivulets that merged into streams. The gaps where Avery had stolen my bags became channels funneling runoff directly toward my foundation. The storm wasn't my enemy anymore, it was her sabotage. Inside, I stripped off the drenched poncho and sat before the monitors, soaked and shaking. I rewound the footage, watching her and that boy dismantle my defenses frame by frame. My jaw clenched so hard it hurt. She hadn't just endangered my property, she had endangered the whole street. By 3 a.m., the power flickered and died. I lit candles, the storm radio buzzing in monotone flash flood advisory. Maple Creek at 96% capacity. Rise expected through dawn. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. I sat in the dark, coffee, black and bitter in my hand, listening to the storm batter, the siding like a siege. And through it all, one thought kept drilling into my skull. If Avery thought she had won, she was about to learn that water doesn't care about rules, and karma doesn't need a committee vote. Dawn didn't come gently. It arrived with a bruised gray sky, heavy with the hangover of the storm, and a smell in the air that told me the creek had finally taken what it wanted. I stepped outside in my boots. Jacket pulled, tight, flashlight still in my hand, even though the sun was trying to burn through the clouds. My yard was a shallow lake. Water pooled in every low spot, circling the gaps where my sandbag wall used to be. The mud bore clear evidence of sabotage. The drag marks of bags pulled away the gouges in the soil where I had stacked them so carefully. The irony, my house was bruised but still standing strong. Water had reached the basement stairwell, seeping under the doorframe, but the extra threshold block I'd wedged in the night before slowed it just enough. My prep work, my paranoia, as Avery called it, had saved me. Her house, though, that was a different story. I waded through the puddled street boots, sloshing the whole neighborhood, buzzing with voices. Neighbors stood on porches in pajamas, coffee mugs, steaming eyes wide as if they'd woken up in another country. "Look," one man shouted, pointing toward the bend of the creek. A few of us followed. The sight stopped me cold. Avery's $1 million car, the one she bragged about at every HOA gathering, the one she polished every Saturday morning like it was a shrine, was half submerged in the raging creek. The front end lodged against 2 cottonwoods, the trunk twisted and buckled like a crumpled can. Mud streaked the once pristine white paint, and the passenger door flapped open with the current slapping against the water with every surge. It didn't look like a status symbol anymore. It looked like a carcass, Gasps rippled through the small crowd of residents gathering at the bank. A woman clutched her toddler tighter. Someone muttered, "My God." Another whispered, "Is anyone inside?" Firefighters soon arrived, red trucks flashing against the washed-out dawn. They waded into the creek tethered by ropes and confirmed the vehicle was empty. Relief washed over the group, but it was thin and nervous. Because empty or not, the wreck told a story, and everyone suspected who had written it. I didn't say a word. Not yet. I turned back toward my house boots, squelching mind racing. Once inside, I powered up my generator long enough to copy the footage from my security system to a USB stick. The images were crystal clear, Avery and her nephew dismantling my barrier, laughing, kicking sandbags down the slope. Her voice carried over the mic, sneering, "Teach him a lesson." When the police finally came, knocking, soaked and harried from the night's emergencies, I met them at the door. Officer Ramirez, clipboard in hand, asked if I'd seen or heard anything unusual. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I simply handed over the USB. "You'll want to see this," I said, my voice flat. He raised an eyebrow. Footage clear as day. Time-stamped. Audio, too. He slid the drive into an evidence bag, his jaw tightening as he scribbled notes. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Miller." By the time the officers left, word had spread faster than the floodwaters ever could. Neighbors trickled over one by one, testing the waters of gossip and outrage. Mrs. Chen from across the cul-de-sac leaned in, whispering, "Is it true? Did Avery?" I didn't answer directly. I just said I documented everything. That was enough. By noon, the neighborhood was buzzing like a kicked hornet's nest. The HOA board members, usually so proud in their clipboards and windbreakers, looked rattled. Avery's Lexus sat twisted in the creek for everyone to see, a billboard of arrogance brought low, and people wanted answers. I finally saw her around 2 o'clock. She stood barefoot in her yard, soaked hair plastered against her face. Her pearls were gone, her blazer discarded. She looked small, fragile even. For the first time since I moved to Maple Creek Estates, she wasn't giving orders. She was silent. Mason, her nephew, hovered behind her, hands on his head, whispering, "Oh my God," over and over like a broken record. That night, the HOA tried to regroup. An emergency inspection, they called it, though it was really just damage control. A few of the board members scurried through the neighborhood with clipboards marking fallen fences and clogged drains, pretending to be useful. But no one was fooled. The residents weren't looking at their fences, they were looking at Avery. At the woman who had preached about uniform flower beds while a flood chewed through our street. When the inspection group reached my lawn, I didn't even wait for them to speak. I pulled up the footage on my laptop, angled the screen so every one of them could see. The board members leaned in, eyes widening as the video played. Avery dragging sandbags, smirking, ordering her nephew around. Her voice was unmistakable. The silence afterward was heavier than the storm. One of the clipboard men finally cleared his throat. "Well, that's quite serious." I snapped the laptop shut. "That's sabotage, on record. You can spin bylaws all day long, but the flood didn't come because of aesthetics. It came because someone removed safety barriers." They shifted uncomfortably, muttering half-formed excuses about personal disputes and misinterpretations. But the truth was undeniable. The evidence was stronger than any HOA fine they'd ever issued. The following morning, a notice appeared in everyone's mailbox. Emergency HOA meeting, mandatory attendance, community clubhouse, 6 p.m. I knew then the tide had turned. Avery had always ruled through fear of citations, fear of embarrassment, fear of being the difficult neighbor. But now fear had shifted. It was no longer about who didn't mow their lawn evenly. It was about whether the people we trusted to lead us had almost drowned us instead. The storm had washed more than mud into our yards. It had washed the mask off Avery Lopez. That evening I stood on my porch, sipping stale coffee, watching residents trickle past toward the clubhouse. Some looked nervous, others angry. A few nodded at me in silent acknowledgement. They knew what I had. They knew the truth was coming. And for the first time since I moved into this carefully curated neighborhood, I felt something that had been missing for too long: leverage. Because water doesn't negotiate, but people do. Especially when the evidence is stacked higher than any sandbag wall I could ever build. The clubhouse at Maple Creek Estates had never seen a crowd like that night. Normally, HOA meetings drew maybe a dozen residents, retirees with time to complain about mailboxes, parents demanding playground upgrades, or Avery's loyal lieutenants who nodded along to every word she said. But this time, the folding chairs filled up fast, extra rows, dragged in from storage neighbors, packed shoulder to shoulder with damp jackets and mud-streaked shoes. The storm had passed, yes, but the damage lingered. Lawns were torn open, fences down, basements flooded. People weren't here to argue about landscaping fines. They were here because they had seen Avery's Lexus twisted like a toy in the creek, and because whispers of sabotage had spread like wildfire. I sat in the back arms, folded the USB drive with my footage resting in my pocket like a loaded weapon. At exactly 6 o'clock, Avery swept in. She was no longer the polished queen of Maple Creek. Her hair hung limp, her makeup gone, and the blazer she wore looked 2 sizes too big, as if she had grabbed it in haste. But she still carried herself like she owned the room. Her heels clicked across the linoleum, echoing in the tense silence. "Thank you all for coming," she began, forcing a smile. "I know the storm was difficult, and I want to reassure you that the board is addressing safety concerns." A hand shot up before she could continue. It was Kathy Tran, a young mother from across the street. Her voice trembled but carried strength. "My backyard was inches from flooding, inches, Avery. We had to carry our toddler upstairs at 2 a.m. because the water nearly came through the door. And you're talking about addressing concerns. What about addressing what you did?" Murmurs swept the room. Avery blinked, caught off guard. "I don't know what you mean." I stood slowly, feeling dozens of eyes turn toward me. "She knows exactly what you mean." Avery's gaze locked onto mine, sharp as broken glass. "David, this isn't the time for personal vendettas." "Personal?" I pulled the USB from my pocket and held it up. "I have footage, time-stamped, audio included. You and your nephew dragging away my sandbags hours before the storm hit. You laughed. You said, 'Teach him a lesson.' Well, the lesson came, Avery, but it didn't land on me. It landed on all of us." The room erupted. Shouts overlapped, neighbors demanding answers, some standing from their chairs, others pointing fingers. Avery's face drained of color. "Lies," she snapped, though her voice cracked. "You edited it. It's out of context." I strode forward, handing the drive to Alan Bishop, the HOA treasurer. He was pale, sweating clearly, wishing he were anywhere else. "Play it," I said simply. He fumbled with the projector, connecting it to the clubhouse laptop. A few seconds later, the screen flickered to life-grainy night vision footage, filling the wall. Gasps rang out as Avery appeared unmistakable, dragging sandbags across my yard. Mason followed, struggling under the weight. Her voice cut through the room. "He's not going to win this time." When the video ended, the silence was deafening. No one coughed. No one shuffled. Every eye in the room was on Avery. Her lips trembled. That's not what it looks like." Kathy Tran stood, baby on her hip, voice firm. "It looks like you nearly drowned us to make a point. My husband barely stopped the water from coming inside. If Mr. Miller hadn't had some bags left, our street could have been under." An older man, Greg Stanton, raised his voice. "She put property values over human safety, over our kids." One by one, voices joined. Accusations, demands, fury that had been simmering under Avery's rule for years now boiled over. People brought up old fines, threats, how she bullied anyone who didn't comply with her precious uniformity. The storm had stripped away her shield, and now the mob saw the truth. Alan Bishop finally raised his hands for quiet. "Enough. We can't continue like this. Avery, you've crossed a line. You've endangered the neighborhood. Effective immediately, I'm calling for your suspension as HOA president pending removal." The room broke into applause, loud, cathartic, angry. Avery's face twisted, shock turning to rage. "You can't do this," she shrieked. "I am the HOA. I built this community." "No," I said, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "You built a facade. A stage where you got to play queen while ignoring the real problems. Nature doesn't bow to bylaws, Avery, and now neither do we." Her mouth opened, but no words came. She stood frozen heels, wobbling on the cheap carpet, before storming out of the clubhouse. The door slammed behind her, rattling on its hinges. When she was gone, Alan turned back to the room. His voice shook, but steadied with resolve. "We need a new approach. A safety and resilience committee. Real planning, not just fines and flowers. And I propose David Miller as our technical advisor." The murmurs rose again, this time approving, supportive. Faces turned toward me, not hostile, not skeptical, but hopeful. It was a look I hadn't seen since my army days, when soldiers waited for orders in the middle of chaos. I cleared my throat. "I'll do it. But only if we agree on one thing, no more pretending. We prepare or we drown. Those are the only options." Heads nodded, some clapped, others murmured agreements. For the first time since I moved into Maple Creek Estates, I didn't feel like an outsider shouting into the wind. I felt like someone people were finally ready to hear. When the meeting adjourned, neighbors came up to shake my hand, thank me, ask for advice. It was overwhelming, but I welcomed it. Because maybe, just maybe, this flood had done more than destroy it, had woken people up. As I stepped back into the damp night, the air smelled of wet earth, and something else changed. Avery's reign was over her luxury car, rotting in the creek like a monument to arrogance. The neighborhood had seen the truth, and there was no unseeing it. Still, a part of me knew the fight wasn't over. Pride like Avery's doesn't vanish overnight, and even without her badge and clipboard, she was still dangerous, cornered, desperate. But for now, the balance had shifted. The flood had washed away more than mud and debris, it had carried away her crown. And for the first time, Maple Creek Estates belonged not to one woman's ego, but to the people who lived here. The morning after the emergency meeting, the neighborhood looked like a battlefield where the enemy had retreated but left scars behind. The storm had rolled east, leaving Maple Creek Estates soggy and bruised. Trash cans floated at odd angles like stranded buoys. Lawn ornaments lay shattered against fences. The air carried that pungent blend of mud, gasoline, and wet wood, a smell I'd encountered in flood zones across the world, and one I never thought I'd breathe again once I retired. I stood on my porch with a mug of bitter coffee scanning the wreckage. And there it was again, like some grotesque statue in a gallery of ruin. Avery's million-dollar car still lodged sideways in the creek. The rescue crews had tried to winch it out overnight, but the current and debris had fought them off. Now it sat half-buried in silt, the morning sun glinting off its twisted metal, a monument to vanity undone. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering and pointing. Some shook their heads in pity. Others smirked openly. Children who should have been in school gawked at the wreckage like it was a fallen spaceship. And Avery, she didn't come outside. Not at first. But around 9 o'clock, her front door creaked open. She stepped out slowly, barefoot, hair tangled, wearing nothing but a gray hoodie and sweatpants. No pearls, no blazer, no badge. Just a woman stripped of her armor. Mason trailed behind her shoulders, slumped face pale. He looked more like a prisoner than a relative. The murmurs grew louder. Someone muttered, "There she is." Another said, "About time." Avery ignored them. She stared at the creek, arms limp at her sides, eyes fixed on the wreckage of her prized possession. For the first time since I'd known her, she seemed small, defeated. But sympathy didn't come easy. Not when I remembered the way she'd kicked my sandbags down the slope laughing. Not when I replayed her words, "Teach him a lesson." By noon, the police returned. 2 officers in dark uniforms walked up her driveway. I couldn't hear their words, but I saw the exchange. Avery gesturing wildly, shaking her head, then finally lowering her face into her hands. Mason just stood there, lips moving silently like he was reciting an apology no one wanted to hear. Later that afternoon, Officer Ramirez came to my porch again. His boots tracked mud across the steps as he pulled out a notepad. "Mr. Miller," he said, "we've reviewed the footage you provided. It's conclusive." I nodded. I figured. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Here's the situation. Technically, removing your sandbags isn't a criminal act under city code. Property disputes get messy, especially under HOA covenants. But the timing, the intent, it could fall under reckless endangerment. And considering the damage," he trailed off, eyes flicking toward the creek. "I'm not asking you to arrest her," I said firmly. "I just want it documented. People deserve to know what nearly happened because of her pride." He exhaled through his nose. "You'll get your documentation. Believe me, the city's already interested. A car like that ending up in a public waterway, it raises flags at the county level." I thanked him and he left. The weight of his words sank in. This wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. This was bigger. By evening, the HOA board, what was left of it, circulated another notice. Official statement pending. Investigation underway. The paper felt hollow in my hands. For years, they'd churned out memos about lawn height and mailbox paint, but now, with real danger, they floundered. The real verdict came not from them, but from the residents. As the sun dipped low, a crowd formed in front of Avery's house. Neighbors who had once kept their curtains drawn now stood together demanding answers. Kathy Tran spoke first, baby on her hip. Her voice cut sharp through the humid air. "You put us all at risk. You tore down his sandbags and my yard nearly flooded. My child could have been hurt." Avery stepped onto her porch, trembling but defiant. "You don't understand. He broke the rules. He made us look like a disaster zone. I was protecting the community's image." That word image lit the crowd on fire. Greg Stanton, the retired insurance broker, barked out a laugh. "Image. Half the neighborhood was bailing water with buckets. Your image almost drowned us." More voices joined in overlapping accusations. "You endangered my family. You lied about the flood zone. You cared more about your car than our safety." Avery raised her hands, desperate. No one was hurt. That proves my point. The panic was unnecessary. I stepped forward, then the circle parting as eyes turned to me. My voice was calm, but every word landed like a stone. No one was hurt this time. But that wasn't luck. It was preparation. You destroyed the barrier I built, and still by the grace of timing, the water didn't climb far enough. What if it had? What if a child had been caught in it? Your car in the creek is proof that rules without reason are worthless. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm clouds had been. Avery opened her mouth, but no words came. Her nephew Mason tugged at her sleeve, whispering, but she shook him off. Finally, Alan Bishop, the treasurer, spoke from the edge of the crowd. His voice cracked with shame. Avery Lopez, as treasurer of this HOA, I'm formally requesting your resignation, effective immediately. Gasps, then murmurs of agreement. Kathy Tran said seconded. Greg Stanton shouted third. Others chimed in. The momentum was unstoppable. Avery's eyes darted around searching for allies. But there were none. Even her clipboard carriers from the inspection team stood stone-faced, refusing to meet her gaze. I built this neighborhood, she screamed, voice shrill and raw. I kept it perfect. You'll regret this. You'll all regret this. Her words fell flat. No one flinched. No one backed down. She slammed her door, the sound echoing like a gavel. The crowd slowly dispersed, neighbors returning to their homes, but the air was different now. Heavier, yes, but also freer. A regime had fallen and everyone knew it. I lingered on the street, staring at the dark windows of her house. For years she had ruled with fines and fear. Now stripped of her title, her car, and her credibility, she was just another resident one who had to face the ruins of her own making. And as I walked back to my porch, I realized something: storms don't just test buildings. They test people. And Avery Lopez had failed that test spectacularly. But for the rest of us, maybe, just maybe, the flood had given us a second chance to build not just stronger walls, but a stronger community. The days after Avery's downfall felt surreal. For years, Maple Creek Estates had marched to the click of her heels and the scratch of her clipboard pen. Now her silence was louder than any of her speeches had ever been. The once busy email threads from the HOA stopped abruptly. No more citations for crooked mailboxes or threats about lawn clippings. Instead, the only subject line circulating through our inboxes was, "What happens next?" It didn't take long for the footage to leak beyond the clubhouse. Someone had recorded the emergency meeting on their phone, grainy, shaky, but damning nonetheless. By the next morning, the video had been posted in the neighborhood group chat, forwarded to Facebook community pages, and even circulated by a local news blog under the headline, "HOA President Caught Removing Flood Barriers Before Storm." My phone buzzed nonstop. Some neighbors texted apologies for not listening sooner. Others offered thanks casseroles or spare sandbags for the future. A few even asked if I could take a look at their drainage layouts. It was as if overnight I had become the neighborhood's reluctant storm whisperer. Meanwhile, Avery's house turned into a kind of theater. Cars slowed as they passed drivers craning necks to catch a glimpse of the disgraced president. Neighbors who had once hosted wine nights in her living room now crossed the street to avoid her driveway. Mason, her nephew, was often seen dragging trash bags to the curb, hoodie pulled low, avoiding eye contact. The arrogance was gone from both of them, replaced by something brittle and quiet. But not everyone was ready to move on. 2 nights later, I found Alan Bishop, the HOA treasurer, on my porch. He looked exhausted, his khakis mud-stained, his windbreaker wrinkled like he'd been sleeping in it. He carried a clipboard under his arm, though it seemed more like a shield than a tool. "David," he said, shifting uncomfortably, "we're in trouble." I raised an eyebrow. "We," he sighed. "The board. The city's already reached out. They want an incident report, and they're hinting at liability. If it's proven that Avery acted under the HOA's authority, we could all be on the hook." "She acted alone," I said firmly. "You all saw the footage." "Yes, but the bylaws give her broad enforcement powers. If she claims she was upholding aesthetic guidelines," he trailed off, rubbing his temples. "Look, we need your help. The neighborhood trusts you now. If you can advise us, maybe even speak to the city, we stand a chance at protecting the rest of us from lawsuits." I studied him for a long moment. Part of me wanted to slam the door. These were the same people who'd laughed at my warnings, who'd dismissed my maps and charts as fear-mongering. But another part of me, the part that had spent years in civil service building systems to protect people from disasters, knew I couldn't walk away. "Fine," I said. "But I'm not covering for Avery. The truth stays the truth." Alan nodded quickly, almost too quickly. "Of course, we'll figure out the rest." The following day, the HOA called another meeting. This time it wasn't in the clubhouse, it was in my backyard. My sandbags still stacked, though battered, stood like silent witnesses as half the neighborhood gathered on my damp lawn. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. I spread out FEMA flood maps across a picnic table using coffee mugs to keep them from blowing away. This, I said, tapping the shaded zones, is where the water wants to go. Always has, always will. You can ignore it, but you can't stop it. What Avery did wasn't just petty, it was dangerous, and it nearly cost us more than her car. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Greg Stanton raised his hand. So what do we do now? I took a deep breath. We build smarter, not prettier smarter. That means permanent drainage improvements, emergency protocols, and yes, sandbags. And we stop pretending that a uniform lawn matters more than safety. Kathy Tran chimed in, bouncing her toddler on her hip. I second that. I don't care if my neighbor's yard looks like a construction site during a storm, as long as my kid isn't floating away in the middle of the night. Laughter broke out light but charged with relief. For once, the residents weren't looking over their shoulders afraid of a fine. They were speaking freely. We voted then and there, an informal but powerful moment. Avery was out permanently. A new subcommittee would form focused solely on safety and preparedness, and they wanted me to lead it. I hesitated. I'm not here to run the neighborhood, I said. You don't have to, Alan replied. Just keep us honest. We need someone who knows what they're talking about. The crowd nodded, some clapping, others murmuring agreement. And so, with the mud still wet beneath our boots, Maple Creek Estates took its first step towards something it had never been before, a community that listened. But the story wasn't over. The next morning, I found an envelope in my mailbox. No return address, just my name written in tight, slanted handwriting. Inside was a single line. Don't share the footage. Please. I'll resign quietly. Just let me leave with what dignity I have left. I stared at the paper for a long time, the words trembling slightly, as if her hand had shaken while writing. For the first time, I felt a twinge of pity. Avery had been cruel, arrogant, and reckless, but now she was simply broken. Still, pity didn't erase truth. I folded the letter, slid it into my desk drawer, and whispered to the empty room, "You don't get to decide this anymore," because this wasn't about her dignity. It was about every neighbor who had stood in ankle-deep water, every child who had cried during the storm, every family that had almost lost everything. And if Avery thought she could erase that with a note she was about to learn, one final brutal lesson: water isn't the only thing that rises. Sometimes accountability does too. The emergency meeting at the clubhouse wasn't just another HOA gathering, it was a reckoning. By 6 o'clock sharp, the building buzzed with more energy than I'd ever seen in Maple Creek Estates. The storm might have passed, but the air inside was still charged, as if the lightning had moved indoors. People filed into folding chairs, voices low, eyes sharp. You could feel it in the way they sat. No one was here to talk about hedge heights or mailbox paint. This was about survival and about betrayal. Alan Bishop stood at the front, clutching a packet of notes like it might keep him from drowning. He cleared his throat into the microphone, but his voice cracked anyway. Thank you for coming on such short notice. I know the last few days have been difficult. Many of you suffered damage. Some of you lost property. We as a board have to face hard truths tonight. The murmurs quieted. Every head turned forward. For once, not even the children squirmed. Alan continued. It's no secret there was an incident. We've reviewed the footage, and we acknowledge that former President Avery Lopez acted outside of protocol and without board approval. Effective immediately, she is no longer serving on this board. That last sentence hit the room like a hammer. Gasps, a few relieved chuckles. And then applause, uncertain at first, then swelling into something like catharsis. But Alan wasn't finished. We also need to address a deeper problem. For years, we've prioritized aesthetics over safety. We've fined residents for garden beds but ignored drainage issues. We've demanded uniform lawns but neglected the creek. That ends tonight. He looked straight at me then, and suddenly every face turned my way. I hadn't wanted this spotlight, but it had found me anyway. I rose slowly, the weight of 50 pairs of eyes pressing down, and walked to the front. My name is David Miller. I began steady. Some of you already know I worked as a civil engineer before retiring. I've seen storms tear through places far worse prepared than ours. And I can tell you one thing, with certainty, rules don't stop water. Preparation does. I spread out a map I'd brought taped together from FEMA charts and my own notes. This, I said, pointing, is our reality. Maple Creek Estates sits in a natural basin. Every drop of rain funnels here. The storm we just faced wasn't the worst we'll ever see, not by a long shot. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some nodded grimly, others exchanged uneasy glances. I pressed on. I tried to warn you last year. I showed you runoff models. I asked for small changes, French drains, retention walls, sandbag drills. I was laughed off. That arrogance almost cost lives. And it did cost Avery her car. That earned a bitter chuckle from the back row. But this isn't about her anymore. This is about us. Do we want to keep pretending, or do we want to make sure the next storm doesn't wipe us out? The silence that followed was thick, but it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of people realizing all at once that the ground beneath them wasn't as solid as they thought. Then Kathy Tran stood clutching a crumpled sheet of paper. "My backyard was inches from flooding," she said. "I have a toddler. We barely caught it in time. If David hadn't had some bags left, who knows what would have happened. I move that we form a safety and preparedness committee and that David lead it." Gasps. Then quickly seconded, shouted Greg Stanton. A chorus followed. Third agreed. Alan, sweating, nodded vigorously. All in favor, nearly every hand shot up. And just like that, I had a new job. I cleared my throat. If I'm doing this, there's one condition. No more hiding behind bylaws when lives are at stake. We build protocols. We respect the science. We act like neighbors, not enforcers. If anyone can't accept that, speak now. No one did. The vote carried. Applause broke out again, this time stronger, tinged with relief and maybe a little hope. For the first time since I moved here, I didn't feel like an outsider. I felt like someone the community actually trusted. After the formalities, residents lined up to speak. One elderly woman recounted how her husband slipped in the mud trying to salvage patio furniture. A young father described his panic when he realized the sump pump failed. Others demanded better communication, email alerts, text systems, neighborhood watch groups. The flood had cracked something open, and now people poured out years of fear they'd kept bottled under Avery's regime. Alan scribbled furiously on his clipboard, nodding at every suggestion. For once the board wasn't issuing decrees, it was listening. When the meeting finally adjourned, the room felt different, lighter despite the mud still drying outside. Neighbors clapped me on the back, thanked me, asked when the first drill would be. It was overwhelming, but it felt right. I lingered near the door as people filtered out. That's when I noticed her. Avery. She stood outside in the shadow's hood pulled over her head, face pale under the dim streetlight. She hadn't been inside during the meeting, but she'd heard. Of course she had. Our eyes met through the glass door. For a second, I thought she might storm in, unleash one final tirade. Instead, she turned shoulders, hunched, and walked into the night without a word. Something in me twisted, not pity exactly, but recognition. I'd seen soldiers stripped of rank, officers who thought their authority made them untouchable, until reality proved otherwise. Some crumbled, some clawed back. Avery time would tell. I stepped out into the cool air, inhaling the damp scent of a neighborhood changed. The storm had exposed every weakness we had, but it had also washed away the fear that kept us silent. For the first time, Maple Creek Estates felt like it belonged to the people, not the board. Still, I couldn't shake the thought storms don't end when the rain stops. They linger in the mud, in the cracks, in the silence between neighbors. And Avery Lopez was still here, watching from the shadows, waiting. As I walked home under the flickering streetlights, the USB drive heavy in my pocket, I knew one thing for certain: this fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The weeks that followed felt like the aftermath of a war. The storm had passed, but Maple Creek Estates bore its scars: muddy lawns, warped fences, and driveways littered with branches and debris. Yet something else had shifted, something less visible but far more powerful. The HOA's grip, once ironclad under Avery Lopez, had snapped, and in its place, something unexpected began to grow: community. It started small. The first Saturday after the meeting, neighbors I barely knew showed up in my yard with shovels and gloves. "Figured we'd help clear your ditch," one said. Within an hour, there were kids hauling branches, teenagers stacking sandbags for practice, and retirees drawing diagrams of storm drains. For once, no one asked for permission, no one feared citations. We were just neighbors working side by side. The HOA board, what remained of it, couldn't keep up. Alan Bishop showed up at my door, almost daily, papers in hand, asking for advice. "David, does this drainage plan make sense? Or David, would you review these emergency protocols?" He looked like a man trying to rebuild his credibility, one apology at a time. But Avery, she disappeared. Not physically. Her house still stood at the bend, the curtains drawn tight, but socially. Her Lexus had been hauled out of the creek, a mangled heap, carted away on a flatbed, leaving a muddy scar where it had lodged. After that, she stopped appearing in public. Neighbors whispered about seeing her in the early morning walking Mason to his car, but she never joined the cleanup efforts, never spoke at meetings. Her reign was over, and she knew it. One evening, just as the sky bruised purple with another approaching storm, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Avery herself. No pearls, no polished blazer, just jeans, a hoodie, and eyes rimmed red. She clutched an envelope like it was a lifeline. "I know what you have," she said quietly. I didn't answer. "The footage," she continued. "I know it's out there already, but you have the clearest copy. You could ruin me completely." "You ruined yourself," I replied, voice steady. Her chin trembled. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood, keeping up appearances. If people believed we lived in a flood zone, property values would tank. I was trying to hold us together. "You almost tore us apart," I said flatly. "Your car in the creek is proof enough." She flinched but pressed on. "I'll resign. I'll step down, officially leave the board entirely. Just don't give the footage to the city. Don't let them make me the example." I studied her for a long moment. Behind her, Mason sat in their car, hood pulled up, watching us. His face was pale, drawn, guilty. For a second, I saw the kid as he had been that night, dragging sandbags while his aunt whispered orders. "I'm not burying the truth," I said finally. "But I'm not pressing charges either. If you want to salvage what's left of your name, you go into that clubhouse and admit what you did, publicly, to everyone. Otherwise, the footage speaks for itself." Her shoulders sagged. For once, Avery Lopez had no retort, no order, no sharp barb, just silence. She turned, walked back to the car, and drove away. The next day, a "for sale" sign appeared on her lawn. No fanfare, no open house, just a quiet admission of defeat. Within weeks, realtors came and went. Mason boxed up belongings and Avery vanished. But her shadow lingered. At the next HOA meeting, now chaired by Kathy Tran, the atmosphere was different. The folding chairs were packed, but this time people leaned forward eagerly instead of crossing arms defensively. We reviewed new bylaws, temporary flood barriers permitted without approval during weather alerts, a cap on fines during declared emergencies, a volunteer disaster response team trained in sandbagging and basic first aid. When the votes passed, unanimously applause filled the room. It wasn't the scattered, reluctant kind I'd heard in the past. It was genuine. Afterward, neighbors approached me one by one. Some asked for advice on grading their yards. Others offered thanks. One man said, "David, you gave us back our voice." I didn't correct him, though part of me knew the truth. The storm gave them their voice. Avery's arrogance gave them the courage to use it. I'd just been the one who refused to stay silent. Weeks turned into months. The city got involved, holding hearings about HOA liability in weather emergencies. I testified once, laying out the facts without flourish: the basin topography, the clogged drains, the sabotage. The officials listened, took notes, nodded. Whether real change would ripple beyond our neighborhood, I couldn't say. But Maple Creek Estates had already changed forever. And me, I found myself busier in retirement than I'd ever been on the job. Thursday, evenings became resilience nights. At the clubhouse, maps, drills, Q&As. Teenagers showed up, eager to learn. Retirees brought stories from storms decades ago, and families baked casseroles to keep us fed while we planned. It wasn't about fear anymore. It was about readiness. One quiet afternoon, I walked past Avery's old house. The "for sale" sign was gone, replaced by fresh paint on the shutters and a new family unloading boxes. A little girl chased a golden retriever through the yard, laughter ringing across the street. For the first time in months, that house didn't feel haunted. The creek behind my own home still murmured after rain, its waters brown and restless. I often stood there with my coffee boots sinking into damp soil, listening. The storm had tried to take everything, and Avery had nearly helped it. But the water receded, and in its wake, it left something stronger: unity. Looking back, I realized the real victory wasn't that Avery's car ended up in the creek. It wasn't that she resigned or that her empire crumbled. The real victory was that the neighborhood finally understood safety matters more than symmetry, and neighbors matter more than rules. Because when the next storm comes, and it will, we'll be ready. Together. Life has a cruel way of humbling those who confuse control with care. Avery Lopez believed that by enforcing perfection, she was protecting Maple Creek Estates. But true protection doesn't come from polished lawns or painted fences. It comes from facing danger head-on, from neighbors looking out for each other, from preparation instead of denial. Her downfall taught us a lesson: no rulebook ever could. A community built on fear will collapse, but one built on trust will endure any storm. So if you've ever felt bullied by an HOA or silenced by someone who values appearances over safety, remember, water doesn't listen to arrogance, and neither should you. Stand firm, prepare, protect your home, your family, your truth. What about you? Have you ever faced an HOA gone too far? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because the next storm and the next story is always closer than you think.